What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And the last podcast that we posted for you was on the coddling of the American mind, how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. And we urge you to go back and listen to that. Now we continue along that line and that theme with a new book called The Splintering of the American Mind, William Egginton. And John, here again, we're turning back to the college campuses, and we're trying to answer the question as to whether we are in danger of losing our civic culture. I mean, what is the goal of education if not to expose people to a lot of different ideas?
Well, that's for sure, but I think it's got to start young. I mean, they should be teaching history and early on, so they have a good basis by the time they get to college. Then they can have these conversations. You would hope, but I guess that's not happening anymore.
Evidently. I mean, the New York Times, when they reviewed both the book that we did in the last podcast and this one, and they reviewed them together under the heading, "Does our cultural obsession with safety spell the downfall of democracy?" Now, that sounds pretty dramatic, and it is. But these two books really point out the fact that if we go back to Allan Bloom and the closing of the American mind back several decades ago, there is this issue. Are we just being too safe? Are we trying to coddle? Are we finding these safe spaces? What is it that we're attempting to do in colleges, if not to open people up to new ways of thinking, to getting out of the house and beginning their own journey? And can their journey really be a successful one if, in fact, they are limited in what they find out in college and it only conforms to their own, current beliefs, and we don't want to give them any cognitive dissonance, which is another one of these issues that people talk about today, where people say, don't interrupt me, I'm in my news bubble, and I don't want to hear your views. And that's a dangerous precedent. It really
I
is.
think the other scary part is I don't think kids know about socialism, and there seems to be a move in this country because of the lack of education we're giving them to more of, hey, let's let the nanny state take care of us, and then we'll be all good and fine. It'll be a great place.
Well, if we really do look narrowly at the whole issue today of individual rights and not look at the broader needs of the society in total, we may have some problems going down the road. So, last time we gave you Greg Lukianoff and his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. He wrote that with Jonathan Haidt. This time, William Egginton and The Splintering of the American Mind. Again, a two-parter for you on America Trends. Joining us on America Trends podcast is William Egginton, and the book is called The Splintering of the American Mind, Identity, Politics, Inequality, and Community on Today's College Campuses. And today's campuses have been looked upon as being pretty hostile places for a lot of different thought that may not conform these days. And yet we thought that universities, public and private, were meant to be places where lots of ideas, controversial ones, those that might be marginalized in other cases, would be welcomed. William, what's going on?
Well, I think that's right. The basic idea of the university has always been a place where free thought is protected, where you can have a robust exchange of ideas, even if some people on some side of that debate find those ideas objectionable. And there is some truth to the story that's out there that bit by bit we seem to be losing our focus, our goal of having universities represent that open space for ideas. Now, I say the story that's out there because I also make the point in the book that this story is serving certain interests. There is an increased and very loud narrative that this is completely out of all whack, that every campus is simply awash with radical ideas, that anyone representing another side of the ideological spectrum is drowned out immediately. And I think this is also itself not a true story. I think that there are examples, and those examples are at times egregious. And my colleagues Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have done a good job at pointing out some of those examples, very much not with the purpose of making, overly making the case in an ideological way about those examples. However, there is an entire echo chamber out there that is dedicated to using particular or individual examples as a way of saying that, college is not to be trusted. And we've gotten to the point, very unfortunately, that as a result of some real trends and some overdoing those trends in the media, you have a big portion of the American electorate who have openly said for the first time that they don't, a majority of them have said that they don't trust American colleges to educate their youth. And I think that's really a problem.
Having said that, I don't think we trust too many institutions any longer. So many of them have been under fire. But I want to go back to the notion of the book itself, the splintering of the American mind. For someone who's listening to this who has read other books and is well read in this sphere, they might wonder what relationship your content in this book has to Allan Bloom going back to 1987 and the closing of the American mind.
Right. So Bloom's title obviously inspired my own, as it's inspired some other responses some 30 years after the fact. And the point that I wanted to make is there were some, I think, really good points that Bloom was making. For one thing, I think we have in academia, in particular in the humanities, developed a distrust for some of the fundamental texts of the Western tradition that are important texts for us to know and to read and to discuss. And while on the one hand it is extremely important to diversify canons and listen to new voices, on the other, this does not mean that we should develop an automatic or knee-jerk mistrust for great books just because those books were written by people who we don't consider to be in favor anymore. However, the problem with that argument at the time was that it was made in a way that was openly hostile to the incorporation of new voices, to the idea that the university really is a space for all and not just for some perspectives. This was a time of great foment in a very positive way as well. Universities were welcoming in for the first time generations of scholars and students who were not, quite frankly, white and male and who were looking for having a voice. The point of the splintering of the American mind is that it is now time in some ways to redress a pendulum swing that in some ways has gone too far, which is not to say to push back very important changes, cultural changes, sea changes that have occurred in terms of inclusiveness, but to say now that we have a more inclusive society, we need to continue making it more inclusive. Colleges and the liberal arts really need to be for everyone, and currently they're not. That's a big portion of my argument. Fundamentally, we're aiding inequality in this country. But at the same time, we need to have a space for conversations that include all of those perspectives. We need to be able to have robust debate. And right now, what we've gotten to is a space that includes a whole lot of different voices, but then doesn't allow those voices to talk to each other.
Well, if we call it a balkanization of our students at the expense of a sense of community, let me just read directly from your book. You say, as I argue in this book, some colleges in the 1970s, by accepting and accommodating a justifiable intellectual demand for equal treatment of minority perspectives, were also encouraging the cultivation of isolated identities, and this was happening at the same time as community, the underlying theme of both the post-war economic expansion and the civil rights movement itself, was suffering debilitating attacks from both the right and the left. It's really hard to imagine how we accommodate those various needs for identity as well as community. Help us with that.
Well, I think we accommodate them by understanding that identity is important, but that it's not everything. My identity as a member of a particular group has a history. It defines a great deal of who I am, but it doesn't define 100% of who I am. And a lot of good books about the issue of identity that are coming out these days are making that point. the fact of the matter is every individual has some similarities and some differences from pretty much every other individual. Once you accept that, you can start to say, we have a space to talk about what I consider to be important and good about my particular identity, as, for example, a member of an ethnic minority, or as a member of a historically repressed sexual minority. And these are very important to me. But it doesn't necessarily mean that my interlocutor, because she doesn't share that history, can't come to understand that, and we can't have a fulsome conversation that begins by having a common language to talk about our differences. And I think right now we have developed, unfortunately, such a sensitivity to identity differences that at times we're afraid to even talk about them. And it seems to me that college is the place that, at the very least, we should be learning the skills for discussing those identity differences.
I agree with you totally. I mean, I really do. Having said that, I'm wondering whether there are people who think that by virtue of wanting to claim and reclaim value in their identity, they feel it's necessary to dispel or dismiss some of that which was thought to be the prevailing view at one moment in time.
I think there's some validity to that, and dispelling and dismissing, another word might be criticizing, could be important moves in a conversation. But it doesn't mean that those voices, that thereby one is necessarily silencing all voices that don't conform with yours. And to the extent that contemporary discourse on campus approaches that kind of a poll, one where really all that matters is that you're on my side, and that if you don't support me in every possible way, I'm going to not join in the conversation because, for example, I feel my very essence is in some way questioned. I feel unsafe, and therefore I'm unable to engage in a conversation. Unfortunately, to the extent that we support discourses and reasons of that nature, we're also doing a disservice to students who then go out into the world unable to really find themselves in situations where they can articulate differences without falling into cliches or simply giving over to either the extremes of either complete silence or violence.
Well, how do you navigate that? I mean, you're in a college setting as a professor. I mean, how difficult is it to negotiate these various minefields in a sense?
I think it is difficult, and I think the first step is acknowledging that difficulty. I try to come up with some stories from my own experience teaching at Hopkins and other universities that demonstrate both how difficult it is, but also that it's possible to have conversations about this nature. I think one begins, in classroom settings or in individual conversations with students by acknowledging discomfort, by saying, I know these things are hard to talk about. And I know that when such and such person in the class stood up and said this point, that you may have felt offended by it. I also think it's important that you be able to say that, this offends me and this is the reason why, without thereby casting aspersions on the character of the other person. Simply taking the occasion to talk this out. It's not always going to work, but I think the more comfortable we become at talking about issues of identity, the better we're going to be at not putting all of our self-worth into one particular basket of identity.
What about the polarization that we see in our society in general, and that as expressed in our campus settings today? I mean, help us understand what it's like today to try to get a discourse about the humanities, which you consider, and I do too, to be so important, because I know a lot of people are trying to discard that liberal tradition, trying to say everybody needs a technical background or whatever, but I think the university, as you do, should be a place for expansive ideas. But how much is the polarization in society really working its way through the body politic of universities?
Well, it's kind of going in both directions, isn't it? I mean, I think that's exactly right. Polarization in society is lending itself to a further inability to have broad-based conversations on campus. But also, insofar as, and you cite this tendency in there, I also completely agree with you. Insofar as on campuses we've continued, or we've spread the rhetoric of just talking about an education as if it's a way of getting oneself ahead in the world socioeconomically, and instead of talking about it as a real investment in the political, if you will, fabric of the community of our nation, making possible the actual functioning of democracy. These are big, important goals for education. I think we've almost entirely stopped talking about them. It's important to talk about them, and it becomes harder and harder to talk about them because, in part, our education system has become so stratified by social class and wealth. It becomes difficult, in other words, to put it in a concrete form for me to justify telling parents, absolutely, you should think about education in terms of investment in society when that investment is costing them half of their income. They want to be able to also survive. And we're trying to tell them with every breath, well, it's worthwhile to send your kids to college. And at the same time, we're having generations that are being put into debt like no generation of students has ever seen before. So the two have to go hand in hand. We have to have an affordable, not just higher education system, but education system in general, one that doesn't stratify people and sift them by wealth and opportunity the way that ours is doing. And I think only then can we start with an open mind to think about education the way it needs to be thought of, as not an investment in individuals, not just another quiver in your arrow in your quiver of economic and tools, but rather an investment in the very fabric of our social lives.
I think any of us who have gone to a university recognize that there are importances in the classes and the courses, but also the relationships that we build and the way we begin to live outside our family structure, to understand others. And now that we have more diverse campuses in terms of ethnicity and race and the like, you say that, of course, some of the identity politics does produce value. And I think that's part of the whole experience outside of the classroom. But I'm wondering whether it's having a negative impact on the classroom itself, what is taught, and how careful we are in not expressing certain ideas that might have been heretofore agreed upon, but now are being challenged, and whether we're willing to step up and accept that that challenge is a good one in a scholarly exchange.
No, I agree with you. I think that it is, to a certain extent, the way that we're treating diversity is, as I described before, as a field of identities that are so sacrosanct that you can't violate them in any way, or you can't even expose them to any kind of a threat in any way. The way that we're agreeing to treat them on college campuses is inimical to the idea of free discourse. At the same time, what's also very damaging is that we're allowing education itself to play a role in sifting us into these individual identities that are, quite frankly, segregated by economic ability. The college educated in this country still accounts for a small minority, barely a third, if even. At the same time, even high school education is segregated, as we know, by social class, depending on what kind of a school you can afford to go to, if your parents are opting for private schools, whether that's even a possibility in the first place. But more than that, public education itself has turned into little more than essentially a public version of private education, where one can afford to buy a house or rent an apartment determines the nature of the school that one gets to send one's children to. So in the end, education, instead of becoming what was once referred to at the beginning of the 20th century idealistically as a great equalizer, is perversely doing the exact opposite. It's generating inequality, and it's on the back of this enormous inequality-generating machine that our educational industry has become, that we're now having these conversations, or not even conversations, very limited conversations about identity. And in a way, again, perversely, they're happening at the most elite tips of the educational pyramid.
Are they happening at all, K through 12? I mean, what is the sense of the discourse there, and how careful are those who teach English, history, humanities, having to be, social studies, of course, in the context of what is going on?
I think they're happening, but again, there's an educational pyramid or a privilege pyramid in secondary education as well. And where these sorts of conversations, I think, are happening most robustly are in the robust sense of where students might actually be be expressing opinions about them and having humanistically influenced conversations around race, identity, sexuality, and these sorts of things are precisely in kind of the most elite schools, be they public schools in very, very good neighborhoods or private schools. As we've seen, the tendency has been in public education to, as one says, teach more and more to the tests. And my sense is that with the exception of some very innovative public school students are more often than not also considering their education to be just and primarily a kind of instrument for getting ahead socioeconomically. And therefore, these conversations aren't being had. Rather, they're being pushed aside so that students can thrive at testing, become better and better at sort of answering questions in a preset way in order to get the best possible score that can get them ahead at the next stage in their careers, so to speak.
The book is called The Splintering of the American Mind. William Egginton is with us. And William, you are the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at the Johns Hopkins University, a very prestigious institution. But you write that we are in danger of losing our civic culture. Instead of a forum for engaging in debate and achieving compromise, our public sphere has devolved into a blood sport in which scoring a point for the home team seems preferable to improving the state of the nation. That seems awfully dire in terms of where we are and how you might approach content and subject matter as somebody who directs a humanities institute.
Boy, is it. However, I guess the good news side of this is while I'm talking about the extent to which our education system as a whole, and elite colleges kind of as a microcosm of that, have aided and embedded in this process, that's also, my hope is, a place where a kind of resistance to this tendency can find a foothold. Because that blood sport, as much as it's trumpeted out there in the blogosphere and the media world that our colleges are where identity politics has taken hold, where no one can have an opinion, et cetera, and so forth, and express it freely. In fact, the kind of divisiveness that leads to an absolute breakdown of communication is far worse in the public sphere, right? It's really out there in politics world. That we find a total impossibility for people to speak to the other side, to have rational and civic debate. So as bad as it can be, not always is, but as bad as it can be at elite colleges, I think it's actually worse out there in the real world. My point is that colleges and in education, the educational world in general, needs to be helping prepare the next generation to be able to have the kind of real political debates that aren't taking place anymore. Because
well, absolutely.
Everything's about a soundbite.
But are you able to do that in this environment?
I think we are to a certain extent, and depending on where. So this is a call to arms, if you will, this book, to say, look, this is where things are going well in education. Let's double down on this. And this other way of being is how we're making real mistakes in education, and let's try to correct those. And I think where we've really made mistakes, I think most universities, in fact, are thinking very carefully, and when I say universities, I mean administrators, and I mean professors, and I mean students, are thinking very carefully about the roles of liberal arts in preparing the generation to come to be able to engage in rational discourse. I think those exceptions, we find out about them, and the reactions, they tend to be curative in a way. We hear when those exceptions take place, and those exceptions can be pretty spectacular. And we need to respond to them, and there's great examples. Frank Bruni often writes about them, of college administrators who buck the trend and say, you know what, wait a minute, this is not what college is about, and they say so. And I'm, as you know, far from the only voice who's a professor with plenty of students and an elite university who's standing out there and saying, look, you know, I'm not a right-wing blowhard, but I think this is a problem, and let's talk about it. So I do see a lot of reason and room for hope there. Where I find, as I say, the situation is worse is right now in the political sphere, and that's why I think we need to call on education to help the problem rather than to continue to hurt
But
it.
as you say, under the subheading, and this is deep into the book, The Idea of America, too often today's contributions to the debate about the quality of our civic discourse have devolved into repeating the same pattern of divisiveness. We assume the world must be divided between red and blue, conservative and liberal. So how much are you fomenting that within the construct of a university setting when we see lots of speakers ultimately disinvited on university campuses or scorned, ridiculed, booed off the stage? What is that pattern that we're establishing at these very good higher education institutions?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's exactly what we're doing, very unfortunately. When events like that happen and they get trumpeted out to the media, and it's understandable that they do, disinvitations, booing off of stages of speakers, even events that have led to violence, like at Middlebury 2 years ago when Charles Murray spoke there or attempted to speak there unsuccessfully. Yeah, of course, these are fomenting exactly the same kind of, in fact, adding fuel to the fire of our divisiveness, and I think that's very much one of the points that I want to make. Yeah, just to keep in mind that the other part of the mistake that we're making is continuing to double down on an educational system that is actually creating the economic grounds for that kind of divisiveness by contributing to inequality as opposed to equalizing. That's sort of the two sides of the conversation that I want to keep in balance, as it were.
When we look at higher education today, and we look at the way that it is established and set up, I mean, we have been trying to bring more diversity to institutions like yours, Johns Hopkins and others. How successful have we been?
Well, we've been quite successful, and the more we focus our efforts, the more successful we're becoming. I think in the last, I may not get the statistics exactly right, but at Hopkins, for example, in the last decade, we've more or less doubled the percentage of students who qualify for Pell Grants, which is one of the measures that we use to decide whether a student comes from a family that is economically needy or not. Now, granted, these are still very much the minority of not just Hopkins students, but students at all elite colleges. And, of course, they're not necessarily the minority nationwide, so that means we're still not being representative. So more can and should be done. But I think the overall picture also needs to recognize that of the nation's college students, and I mentioned before that in the end, at the way things are going, only about a third of American citizens ever end up with a college degree. Of those, it's really close to 1% who are studying at any given time at a four-year elite university, private or public. The large plurality of college students are taking courses usually while working at community colleges. So the point of this is to say colleges with endowments and places like Princeton, which has one of the largest endowments in the country, has done yeoman's work of increasing its representation of families, students from families who are dependent on Pell Grants. Simply using the endowment to make tuition and room and board as close to free as possible. We can do a lot, but it's still only going to be a drop in the bucket. We really need to move towards a situation in which more people can qualify to get into college, and those who can qualify have a grant system that's going to make that college as affordable as possible and not leave a generation of people in debt just because they've tried to get a college education.
But given the fractionalization and a lot of the identity politics that is creeping into a lot of academic study these days, the more diverse that we are making the university setting, are we likely to fall into a situation where building a core curriculum that is broad, diverse, and may offer contradictory points of view and old, established ways of looking things from Western civilization to Eastern civilization, that will be rejected or at least challenged in a material way? How hard is it going to be as we diversify to develop a curriculum in humanities and liberal arts that can really meet the needs of all the students there?
it is hard, and it has been since the 1960s and 70s. No set of faculty is ever going to agree ultimately on the same curriculum, and when they have, the program at St. John's or the core curriculum at Columbia, that at Chicago, these are very much in a minority right now, and they're even contested at those universities. Here's the fact of the matter is canons change over time. They always have, and they always will. I actually believe that diversity of all kinds, economic as well as racial, gender, all kinds, the more diversity you have, as long as you're keeping open the possibilities of avenues for discussion, should ultimately lead to a situation in which these kind of conversations are easier, not harder to take place. Because you have to imagine yourself, if you're coming from a position that has, with justification, always felt itself an identity that's felt itself to be beset, traditionally oppressed, marginalized, you're going to fight for that position with a lot more tenacity than if you're coming into an arena where you feel from the get-go that you're accepted and that your opinions are valued. So the more we can come to a position where all positions coming into it are feeling valued, and that we create an atmosphere in colleges to have those conversations where the interlocutors feel valued, then I think we're actually going to make the situation better, not worse.
But do we have to be in a place for a while where there's some displacement of the old in order to introduce the new, the varied, those who have been marginalized and isolated? Is that where we are today, or where are we on today's American campuses, particularly institutions like yours, the Ivy League schools and the like?
It depends very much on the school, but yes, we're in a place where, as we have been since at least the 1980s, where the borders of canons are being discussed. I think it's important not to throw everything out. I think it's important to have these conversations and to make concerted arguments about why certain traditions of thought are important. And that's as you referred to the section of my book on community, the final text, the idea of America. These ideas that come from the liberal tradition are important to the essence of what America is. And the essence of what America is to me is exactly a repudiation of blood and soil identity. It's about different identities, e pluribus unum, different identities coming out of their difference in order to and brought together by an idea. And that idea is ultimately equality. That's the magical idea of what I consider to be the core American identity. Once we start to lose sight of that, and we're not doing everything we can to support it, then the whole tissue of what America is gets lost. And I think there is an intellectual tradition and that needs to be guarded and saved and discussed. That's the important thing. Philosophized about, criticized. All of that comes from the same intellectual tradition. And then within that, then new voices need to be mixed in. And they always have been, and they always will.
In closing, you say that listening to each other isn't just some surface fix. It's foundational to the very idea of liberty that the U.S. claims to embody. So are we listening to each other today, or are we walking past each other today? Where are we, particularly on the campuses today?
So I think, as I said, on the national stage, we're walking past each other, and we have been walking past each other for a while on college campuses as well. I think we need to do more, and it's a trend that I note and I see happening at all levels in education. We need to strengthen that trend, the trend of not walking past each other anymore, but creating spaces, in particular in the liberal arts and the humanities, to have those conversations. When we see that, we need to support it. When we see examples of the opposite, we need to call them out. This is a moment. It's a moment when education can step up to its proper role, and I'm just very much hoping that we do that.
So in the vernacular, is that the opposite of a safe space?
It is the opposite of a safe space. That's exactly right. And think about it this way. You should feel safe in your person, be it in your home, be it in your city, in your community, or on your college campus. But it's not about safety from opinions. It's not about safety from ideologies. It's not about safety from robust argumentation. There you should feel exposed, because it's only through exposure that you can create intellectual growth.
The Splintering of the American Mind. William Egginton has been with us. The subtitle is Identity Politics, Inequality, and Community on Today's College Campuses. Thank you so much for being with us on America Trends.
It was my pleasure, Larry. Thanks for inviting me.